Alright YouTube, so we are back of course to talk about some Final Fantasy VII Remake, and what we have today is a couple of important updates in regards to Remake itself, Intergrade, the Yuffie DLC, and all that other shit. Now there is an interview out there from Famitsu with Tetsuya Nomura that Audrey translated on Twitter. That has some updates and stuff for Ever Crisis, and I was going to include that in this video, but we might just do like a separate video tomorrow or something for Ever Crisis. But there is part of this interview that is about Remake, which we're obviously going to look at. So as always, just going to hop right into it, and the main thing from this is that there's not going to be any more DLC for Remake Part 1. Or at least there's no plans for DLC. Nomura specifically says, sorting out the development environment on PS5 for Intergrade meant that moving on to developing the sequel was much smoother. We're now prioritizing the roadmap for completing the next game, so if we do need to think about more DLC, then it'll probably come out after that is finished. So what he's saying there is that if they do have any ideas or plans for any other DLC, that's probably not happening until after Part 2 is completed. Which would then of course mean the DLC would come out for Part 2, because it wouldn't make sense for them to complete Part 2, develop DLC, and then put it out for Part 1. Like, that doesn't really make any sense. But at the same time, Intergrade is coming to PS5, Part 2 is going to be on PS5, and if it's a standalone DLC like this Yuffie DLC is, then I guess technically it doesn't matter which game it's for, it's just a standalone DLC. The only thing that would kind of determine whether or not the DLC is specifically for Part 1 or Part 2 is if there's like mechanics in Part 2, like new like battle mechanics, new like environmental things you can do, you know, things that didn't exist in Part 1, they would be in the DLC, then it'd kind of have to come out for Part 2, technically. Now, the other takeaway from this, of course, is that Nomura says that there's no plans for DLC, and that if there is any coming out, it'd probably come out after Part 2 is finished, but that doesn't write it off completely, right? It's not impossible for them to put out more DLC. Maybe as they're making Part 2, they come up with an idea. Maybe they want to do a Sid or Vincent or something DLC, whatever. I'm not saying it's going to happen, I'm just saying it's a possibility. Now, that all being said, if there's not any more DLC at all between Part 1 and Part 2, that's not really a surprise. We all expected something. We didn't know what it was going to be exactly, whether it was going to be something like the Walk to Calm and maybe the Calm flashback or something along those lines. We just had no idea. We expected something, but nothing more than just that, right? One piece of DLC and then Part 2. That's kind of what we've been discussing for a while. Anyways, on to what is probably the more main topic of the video here. The more important thing I'd say is that we had somebody notice the ESRB rating of Intergrade on the PlayStation 5 store, or just PlayStation Network, however you want to say it, and notice something interesting. Shout out to Phantom Dirge on Twitter. This is personally how I had seen or heard about this, but also shout out to BlitzZ, who is a fellow FF7 content creator that I believe is the person who discovered this. So if you hop it over to the FF7 Remake Intergrade page on the PlayStation Store, one thing stands out about the ESRB rating compared to the original FF7 Remake, and it's that it has a blood rating. And this is kind of a big deal, because this was something we discussed quite a bit leading up to the release of Remake, because we got the official ESRB rating, but there was no blood. Despite the original game in 1997 having a blood rating as well, and still being rated teen. And given that we knew that Remake was going to be Midgar only, there's at least one section of the Midgar segment from the original game where there is a shit ton of blood whenever Genova gets broken out of the cell, and there's just blood trails all throughout the Shinra building. So we were like, why is there no blood rating? There should be. And once we got Remake in our hands, we learned that's because there wasn't. There was now a gooey purple trail thing, or whatever it is. So that's what happened back to the Intergrade rating and seeing blood. It has people a bit excited because that's something we expected from Remake Part 1 and we didn't get that. But it seems like this DLC is going to have some. But there are some things we got to discuss as well. So first up, Remake Intergrade itself does not have an official ESRB page yet. I don't know if it's ever going to. I don't know if it needs it because it's, you know, kind of a definitive edition of the game, so to speak, but it has additional content. It's also on PS5 instead of PS4. So I don't know if that requires its own official ESRB page, but that's one thing. The other thing is, somebody pointed out on Twitter in response to Phantom Dirge's tweet about this, that Yuffie's limit break within the DLC called Bloodbath seems to show a shit ton of blood at the end of it, and that could be all that this blood warning is for, potentially. Specifically the part at the end where the guy seems to explode into like a mist of blood, like that could maybe be what the blood warning's for. So while the like blood ESRB rating, warning, whatever you want to call it, is a bit exciting, it could simply be just for that. I can't think of anything else anyways. And plus this DLC is entirely new content. It's outside of her, you know, limit break, we can't even begin to speculate where there would be blood because it's all brand new. I did see some people on Twitter like saying that they're a bit skeptical on this, and I don't know why you would be, outside of the possibility of this just being a placeholder ESRB rating until there's an official one, which I don't even think that would be a thing. Why would you be skeptical? If there's a blood warning, it's because there's goddamn blood. That's sort of how that works. Now, moving beyond this, the blood rating itself has people excited for, of course, the future games, the future remake games, where there are segments where you see some gore and some blood, right? With, like, again, the Midgar Zolm's a perfect example of this. That's something that a lot of us are wanting and hoping to see, and based on Remake Part 1, it didn't seem like that's something we could see. But now that we have a blood rating for Intergrade, it does seem like it could be a possibility. Now, to what degree, it's hard to say. Like, they could do, like, with Sephiroth stabbing Barret. Like, we've seen that. We've seen Barret get impaled, but it wasn't gore, there was no blood. So maybe we could come upon, you know, a Midgard's impaled on a tree, but there's just not just blood fucking everywhere. Now, that's not particularly what anybody wants, obviously, but that's the way they could have, like, that scene from the original game. It just wouldn't be, like, gory and bloody and shit. Now, what's weird to me, though, is, like, I'm pretty sure they've explained in interviews, like Katase, Nomura, whoever, why they did the purple glow trail thing. But if a blood rating doesn't change the actual rating, like, if you can have blood in your game, but it's still a T-rated game, why not just do the blood trail? And what some people have speculated is that maybe they heard the bit of backlash or so from the purple glowy gooey trail, whatever that shit is, and maybe that's why they're putting a little bit of blood into this DLC to kind of let people know that, hey, going forward, it's going to be a bit more mature, so to speak. And I realize it's not the biggest deal ever, like, we don't have to have blood for it to be a good game, but FF7 is a very mature game despite being a T-rated game, and we all kind of expected some of these things from the original to be in Remake, and it wasn't. And it worries me for stuff like the dying scene. I've said this before in the past, I will always talk about this scene until we see what they do with it in Remake. But the fact that they couldn't handle, you know, a little bit of gore and blood from Jenova breaking out of her cell and killing people, because that's what she did in the original game, that's what she should be doing in Remake, it makes you wonder how they're actually going to handle the Barret and dying dynamic. Like, that's a very, very mature scene. Are we going to get the same thing from FF7, or is it going to be dumbed down and not as serious? That worries me. I said before in the past, like, this segment of the game for me is sort of the measuring stick when it comes to Remake and the dev team and how serious I feel they are when trying to retell the FF7 story in a modern way, but also a mature way. And this is a scene that I want damn near shot for shot. It's obviously going to be different because of Remake, it's going to be expanded. But if there is a rock out of place, I'm going to be upset. And the fact that they can't commit to just a little bit of blood with the Jenova breaking out of the cell segment makes me wonder if we're even going to get this scene at all. Anyways, my dudes, that's pretty much the video. This is the least exciting for the future of Remake and the Remake project. It remains to be seen once the UFI DLC comes out to what degree there is blood, if there even is at all. But of course, I want to pass off to you guys. What are your thoughts on the possibility of blood in the Remake games going forward? As of right now, me personally, I am hopeful, but I'm also very reserved, keeping the expectations in check. You know how we got to do it when it comes to Remake, because they let us down with the first game, at least in that regard. Other than that, that's the video. Hopefully you enjoyed it. If you did, give it a thumbs up. Subscribe to the channel if you guys aren't new. Most updated more Final Fantasy VII Remake content. Turn on my notifications. Follow me on Twitter, @NewYT. I'm my Discord. Links to my social networks are in the description. In the outro. Later, guys.
Used to care what people thought, but now I care more, and nobody out here's got it figured out. So therefore, I've lost all hope of a happy ending, depending on whether or not it's worth it. So insecure, no one's perfect. We spend it with no shame. We blow that like Coltrane. We in here like Low Gain or leave it like Cobain.